Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're talking about something extremely powerful, how to remember everything you want. This topic has been on my mind for a long time because so many people think they have a bad memory, but actually, that's not true. Most people don't have a weak memory. They simply don't know how memory works. I've spent a lot of time reading books, watching researchers, and testing techniques myself. And honestly, Lana, memory is a skill. It's like a muscle. You train it and it grows. But if you don't use it properly, it gets weaker. What makes me excited is that with the right strategies, people can remember names, ideas, information for studying, languages, or even personal goals. And all of this can be learned step by step.
I completely agree. People often say things like, "Oh, I'm forgetful," or "My brain doesn't work like that." But most of the time, it's not a memory problem. It's a method problem. And when you understand how your brain remembers things, everything becomes easier. We're going to talk about powerful techniques today, not boring theory, but practical tools that anyone can use right away. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why some things stay in your mind forever and why other things disappear immediately. And what's even more interesting is that we already use many of these techniques without knowing it. For example, we remember songs effortlessly, we remember embarrassing moments vividly, and we remember stories more than numbers. That tells us something important. Our brains love meaning, emotion, and connection. So if we learn how to use that, we can remember almost anything.
Exactly. I want to start with the biggest secret in memory science, and it's surprisingly simple. The brain is not made for remembering random information. If something feels boring, disconnected, or unimportant to us, the brain basically says, nope, not worth storing. This is why students forget pages of notes but remember a funny moment in class. It's why people remember their first crush, a childhood memory, or their favorite movie quotes, because those things carry emotion, context, and personal meaning. So one of the keys to remembering anything is to give meaning to it. And this doesn't mean emotional meaning necessarily, it just means making the information more alive. For example, if you're learning vocabulary, don't just look at the words. Connect them to something. Imagine them. Create a small story with them. Your brain loves stories.
You're right. And that brings me to something that blew my mind when I first learned it. Memory is not a storage box. It's a connection system. People imagine the brain like a drawer where you put information and take it out later. But in reality, memory works like a map. Everything is connected to something else. When we forget, it's usually because we didn't build enough connections. And when we remember easily, it's because there are many paths leading to the same piece of information. For example, when you try to memorize someone's name and only hear it once with no extra context, of course you forget it. But if you imagine their face, associate their name with something funny, repeat it once or twice, and use it in conversation, suddenly you remember it forever because now the name is connected to multiple things. This is why techniques like visualization, linking, creating stories, and associations work so well.
Yes, and speaking of techniques, one of the most powerful methods for remembering anything is the memory palace, also known as the Loci method. It's been used for thousands of years by ancient Greek philosophers, Roman senators, and even world memory champions today. The idea is simple. You choose a place you know very well, your home, your school, your room, your street, and you mentally put pieces of information inside specific locations. For example, if you want to remember a list of things, apples in the fridge, milk on the sofa, bread hanging from the window, keys on the lamp. It sounds crazy, I know, but your brain loves weird images. The stranger the image, the stronger the memory. And the reason the memory palace works so well is because you are using your spatial memory, the same system that helps you walk home without thinking. That part of the brain is extremely strong. So when you combine information with places, you can remember huge amounts of material easily.
Yes, and what I love about the Memory Palace is that it's fun. Memory doesn't have to be boring or stressful. When you make things crazy, colorful, exaggerated, or funny, suddenly your brain pays attention. For example, if you want to remember the word courage, imagine a lion wearing sunglasses and dancing on your table. Sounds ridiculous, but it works. The brain says, "What is that?" and saves it. But if you just read the word courage in a notebook and move on, you forget it easily. Another powerful technique is active recall, asking yourself questions and trying to bring the information from your brain instead of just looking at notes repeatedly. This strengthens memory like lifting weights. It's effortful, but that effort is what builds strong memory. It's how you remember things long term, not just for a day or two.
Right. And another key part of memory is spacing. Our brains are not meant to remember something we study once. People often make the mistake of studying intensely for hours in one day and then forgetting everything. But research shows that shorter study sessions spread over time are far more powerful. For example, studying something today for 20 minutes, then again tomorrow for 10 minutes, then again in 3 days for 5 minutes, can help you remember the information for months. This technique is called spaced repetition, and it's used in apps like Anki and Quizlet. It works because you're training your brain to remember at the exact moment you're about to forget. That's when learning becomes strongest. So if someone wants to remember everything from school material to languages, spaced repetition is life-changing.
And let's not forget one more thing. Memory and attention are best friends. If you're distracted, tired, or mentally scattered, your brain literally cannot send information into long term memory. This is why people forget what they read when they are scrolling through their phone at the same time, or why they forget what a teacher said during a boring lecture. The brain doesn't store information that doesn't receive focus. So, a big part of improving memory is improving your focus habits. Even 5 minutes of deep attention can help you learn more than 30 minutes of distracted attention. And because we live in a noisy world, training your focus becomes even more important for strong memory.
Absolutely. And the last point I want to add for today's section is this. You remember what you understand. Many people try to memorize things they don't truly understand. They repeat the words, but they don't connect them to meaning. But memory becomes effortless when understanding is strong. For example, when you understand how a story works, you remember the details naturally. When you understand a math concept, the steps become easy. But if you try to memorize without understanding, it's like writing on water. So a huge part of remembering everything is simply slowing down, asking questions, and making sure the information makes sense. Understanding is the foundation. Memory builds on top of it.
So, now that we've talked about how memory works and why the brain prefers meaningful, emotional, and connected information, I think it's important to bring up something that most people underestimate: the role of imagination. People often say they are not creative, but imagination is not something reserved for artists or writers. Imagination is actually a fundamental part of how memory works. When you imagine something vividly, even if it's exaggerated or unrealistic, your brain treats it almost like a real experience. And real experiences always stay in the mind longer than abstract information. For example, if I ask you to memorize 10 random numbers, you'll probably struggle and forget them quickly. But if I tell you a short story involving those numbers, like a funny adventure or a strange scenario, suddenly it becomes memorable. So imagination is not optional, it's a tool. And the more you use it intentionally, the easier it becomes to remember anything.
That's a perfect point. And I think what stops many people is that they feel embarrassed even in their own mind. They think, this image is too silly, or this story is too weird. But memory actually loves weird things. The stranger, the better. Let me give a small example. If you need to remember the word breeze, instead of repeating it 20 times, Imagine a giant cold wind blowing through your living room and knocking over your furniture. Or imagine a tiny cloud flying around your house like a drone. Immediately, the word sticks because it's funny, intense, and visual. And visual memories stay longer than verbal ones. That's why when you think of your childhood, you usually remember images, not sentences. The visual part of the brain is huge and powerful, so using visual memory is like activating the strongest engine in your mind.
And this brings us to one of my favorite techniques, the link method, also sometimes called the chain method. It's very simple but shockingly effective. You take each piece of information and link it to the next one through a small story or image. For example, if you want to memorize a shopping list, apples, milk, eggs, bread, you can imagine an apple swimming in a pool of milk, then the milk turning into eggs, and the eggs exploding into slices of bread. Is it logical? No, but that's the point. The brain remembers the strange, the surprising, and the exaggerated. You can use this method for vocabulary, for names, for school material, for dates in history, and so much more. Many students make the mistake of trying to memorize things one by one, but linking them creates a natural chain, and if you remember one part of the chain, the rest follows automatically.
Exactly. And another powerful technique that people rarely talk about is making your brain curious. Curiosity is one of the strongest memory boosters. When you're curious about something, your brain opens up, pays attention, and forms deeper connections. This is why everyone remembers random facts about things they personally enjoy, maybe sports, history, games, movies, celebrities, because curiosity acts like glue. And the great news is that curiosity can be created intentionally. For example, if you're studying something boring, like a long text or a difficult concept, try asking yourself questions before reading. Why is this important? What problem does it solve? How does this connect to something I already know? Or even, what's the most interesting idea in this text? When you approach learning like a detective instead of a passive listener, your brain becomes more active, and active brains remember more.
That's so true. And I love that you mentioned connecting new information with what we already know, because our brain is always looking for patterns. If something fits into a structure we already have in our mind, it sticks immediately. For example, when learning new words in English, instead of memorizing them alone, try grouping them into themes, emotions, travel, food, work, weather, technology, or connect them to synonyms or opposites, or imagine yourself using them in a real situation. Suddenly, the words are not floating in your brain, they belong somewhere. This is why learning becomes faster when you build categories. The brain hates randomness, but it loves organization. And you can create that organization yourself through simple grouping, classification, or even color-coding your notes.
Speaking of organization, let's talk about note-taking for memory, because this is where many students struggle. They write pages and pages, thinking that writing more equals remembering more. But the brain doesn't work that way. What improves memory is processing, not copying. If you take notes word for word from a book or teacher, your brain is not doing much. You're just transferring information, not understanding it. But when you summarize, rephrase, draw diagrams, make mind maps, or highlight key ideas, your brain becomes active, and active processing strengthens memory. So a simple tip for remembering more, don't write everything. Write meaningfully. Ask yourself, what is the main idea? Why does this matter? How can I explain this in my own words? This transforms note-taking from a passive act to a memory-building tool.
Exactly. And I want to add something extremely important for language learners, students, and anyone trying to learn large amounts of information: the forgetting curve. This is a scientific idea by Hermann Ebbinghaus, and it shows how quickly the brain forgets new information. After learning something once, we forget 50% of it the first day, and almost 80% by the end of the week, unless we review it. But the more we review, the slower the forgetting becomes. And after a few reviews, the information becomes long-term memory. This is why people think they have a bad memory. They learn once and expect the brain to keep it forever. But memory doesn't work that way. Forgetting is natural, not a failure. The trick is to review smartly, not constantly. Tiny reviews at the right moment can change everything.
Absolutely. And here's something people often miss. Your environment shapes your memory more than you think. If you're studying in a messy room, with your phone next to you, notifications popping, noise in the background, your brain goes into survival mode. It can't focus. And if it can't focus, it can't store information deeply. So if someone wants to improve their memory, they must design a supportive environment. Put your phone away. Clean your desk. Use soft background sounds if needed. Even lighting matters. Warm light helps you relax. Cold light helps you focus. And your posture matters. If you're lying down, your brain becomes sleepy. If you sit upright, your brain wakes up. Memory isn't just mental, it's physical. Your body and your environment influence how well you remember.
And we should definitely talk about the role of sleep, because people underestimate how important it is. During sleep, your brain processes everything you learned during the day, cleaning out unnecessary information and strengthening important connections. If you don't sleep enough, you forget faster, your focus drops, and your ability to store new information becomes weaker. It's like trying to save files on a computer with no space left. Nothing gets stored. So if someone wants to remember things better, they must protect their sleep. Even short naps during the day can boost memory. And quality matters more than quantity. Deep sleep cycles are where the magic happens. Consolidation, organization, and storage. So memory improvement is not just about techniques. It's also about lifestyle.
You know, Lana, a lot of people ask me why they forget things, even after using techniques like visualization or note-taking. And honestly, one of the biggest reasons is that they try to memorize things they don't really understand. Understanding comes before memory. If you don't understand what something means, your brain has nothing to connect it to, so it treats it like noise. This is especially true for students who memorize definitions or formulas without knowing their purpose. The brain is not designed to store empty symbols. It needs meaning. For example, if you try memorizing a math formula by repeating it, you'll likely forget it quickly. But if you understand what each part of the formula represents and why it works, then remembering it becomes almost automatic. So sometimes the solution to bad memory isn't a technique, it's deeper comprehension.
That's such a crucial point. I remember when I was in school, I used to force myself to memorize biology definitions word for word. I'd repeat them over and over until I felt confident, but after the exam, everything disappeared. Later, I learned that if I had just understood the concept first, like imagining the process of digestion or drawing how cells work, the memory would have stayed naturally. Understanding creates hooks in the brain. It's like hanging something on a wall. If the wall is blank, the object falls. But if the wall has structure, the memory has support. Even when learning languages, understanding context helps more than memorizing isolated vocabulary. When you understand how a word is used emotionally, culturally, and grammatically, it becomes part of your memory system.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most powerful memory tools ever created, the memory palace, also called the method of Loci. It's one of the oldest techniques in history and still used by memory champions today. The idea is simple. You imagine a familiar place, like your house, your school, or a street you know well. Then you place the information you want to remember inside that place as visual objects. The reason it works is because spatial memory is extremely strong. We are designed to remember locations, where food is, where danger is, where objects are. Our ancestors needed that ability to survive. So when you attach information to a location, you're using a natural superpower. For example, if you need to memorize 10 vocabulary words, you can imagine each word inside a different room in your house. And when you mentally walk through the house, each word appears. It's almost magical.
I love the memory palace. It feels like turning your brain into a 3D map where everything has a place. And it doesn't have to be complicated. People think they need to build huge palaces or memorize 100 rooms, but you can start with just your bedroom. For instance, imagine your desk holding one idea, your closet holding another, your bed holding a third. As long as the images are strong and vivid, your brain remembers them instantly. And what I find fascinating is that the more emotional, strange, or dramatic you make the objects, the faster they stick. Like, if I want to remember the word courage, I might imagine a giant lion sitting on my bed reading a book. It's funny, but it works because the brain pays attention to emotions, animals, movement, and unexpected situations.
Yes, unexpected things make memories stronger. Normal things are forgettable because the brain sees them every day. But anything unusual grabs attention. This is why most of our memories come from emotional events: birthdays, fights, celebrations, surprises. The brain marks those moments as important. And we can replicate that effect intentionally by exaggerating the images in our mind. For example, if you need to remember the word mirror, don't imagine a normal mirror. Imagine a mirror that screams when you look at it, or a mirror that shows you wearing a superhero costume. Suddenly, the word becomes unforgettable. It's funny how simple it is. People think memory is about intelligence, but it's really about creativity and emotional engagement.
And while visualization is powerful, there's another technique I really want us to talk about because it helps with not just remembering, but also understanding, teaching others. When you teach something, even if it's just to an imaginary person, you activate many areas of the brain at once. Language, reasoning, explanation, structure, memory. It forces the brain to organize information and make it clear. And when the brain organizes something, it remembers it. That's why teachers and tutors have strong memories, because they repeat the same information in different ways, and their brain builds deeper connections each time. So if someone wants to remember something, they should try explaining it out loud to themselves as if they were teaching it to a beginner. This is called the Feynman technique, named after the physicist Feynman. And it works for everything: math, history, science, languages.
I completely agree, and I actually think that teaching is one of the most underrated learning tools. Most people study silently, but speaking out loud changes everything. It creates movement, sound, rhythm, and structure, all of which help the brain store information. It's also a great way to test if you truly understand something, because if you can't explain it simply, it means you don't fully understand it yet. And that's okay. It just shows you where the gaps are. You can go back, review, and fill in the missing pieces. And here's another benefit. When you teach something, your brain believes that the information is important because you're using it actively, and the brain prioritizes information that seems useful. So teaching transforms passive learning into active memory building.
Speaking of active learning, another incredibly effective technique is using your senses. The more senses you engage, the stronger your memory becomes. For example, reading something out loud engages sight, sound, and speech. Writing something by hand adds touch and movement. Watching videos adds visual and auditory cues. And if you combine them creatively, like writing notes while listening to a podcast and then repeating the main ideas verbally, you're basically multiplying the memory signals. This is why people who study actively with multiple methods remember things faster and keep them longer. The brain is multisensory by nature. It remembers experiences that involve different senses. So if you want to remember something deeply, try involving your voice, your hands, your eyes, and sometimes even your emotions.
Yes, and I think we also need to address the role of repetition, but not boring repetition. People misunderstand repetition and think it means saying something 20 times in a row. That doesn't help much. What works is spaced repetition, reviewing information at intervals. For example, you learn something today, review it tomorrow, then in 3 days, then in a week, then in a month. Each time you review, the brain strengthens the memory and extends how long it lasts. This method is used by language learners, medical students, and memory champions. And the best part is that the reviews don't need to be long. Even 1 or 2 minutes of recall can make a huge difference. What matters is that the brain gets reminded before the memory disappears. It's like watering a plant. A little water at the right time is enough to keep it alive.
When people say, I have a bad memory, the first thing I want to ask them is, bad memory for what? Because most of the time, their memory is actually fine. They just don't connect information in a meaningful way. Our brains are not made to remember random, disconnected facts. They are made to recognize patterns, stories, images, emotions. When something has no connection, it slips away. But if you attach it to something you already know, suddenly it becomes sticky. It doesn't float around on its own anymore. I think this point alone could change someone's entire academic life or even their career. Because the moment you realize memory is about association, you stop saying, I forget everything, and start asking, what can I connect this to?
Exactly. And the funny thing is, most people are already using association without realizing it. Like, if you tell me a new person's name is Sam, maybe I'll automatically think of another Sam I know, or a movie character named Sam, or even my favorite food if it reminds me of something similar. And instantly, I remember the name better. But when it comes to studying or learning new skills, people forget to use the same mechanism. They try to memorize things like cold, dead information, no images, no personal meaning, no emotional layer. And then they get frustrated when the brain says, I don't know what to do with this, and deletes it. So I think one of the easiest memory techniques for anyone is to force your brain to create a link, even if it feels silly, especially if it feels silly.
Yes, silly is actually powerful. The brain remembers anything unusual, emotional, exaggerated, or funny. If you make a crazy image in your mind, it sticks 10 times better than a plain one. For example, suppose you want to remember the word benevolent. Instead of repeating it 50 times, imagine a giant, smiling Ben giving out free gifts to everyone on the street. It's weird, it's visual, it's emotional, and because of that, it lasts. This is why memory champions are able to remember hundreds of random numbers or names. They turn everything into images and stories, not because they are special, but because they understand what the brain prefers. The human brain is basically a visual storyteller, not a list storage machine.
And let's talk about the big secret behind all this. Your brain remembers what you pay attention to. That sounds simple, but it's the foundation of good memory. You can't remember what you didn't notice. People say they forget someone's name right after hearing it, but the truth is, they didn't even hear it properly the first time. Their brain was busy thinking about what to say next, or how they look, or where to sit. So the name passes through the mind like a breeze. No attention, no memory. And I think this applies to studying too. Students read a chapter, but their mind is on TikTok, exams, food, friends. Then they wonder why nothing sticks. If you're distracted, the memory never forms.
Exactly. That's why one of the most underrated memory techniques is simply slow down and notice. If you want to remember a name, repeat it immediately in your mind. If you want to remember a concept, pause and reflect on it for 3 seconds, just 3 seconds. That tiny moment is like pressing the save button. And we don't use it enough. Everyone is in a rush to finish reading or finish listening, but learning doesn't care about speed. It cares about depth. I think a lot of people could remember 50% more just by being present.
This reminds me of something important. Retention depends on engagement. When you are emotionally or mentally engaged with something, it feels easier. Think about how people remember movie scenes, song lyrics, or embarrassing moments from years ago. It's not because their memory is amazing, it's because the moment was meaningful. So if you want to remember anything, languages, science, dates, formulas, you have to make it meaningful for you. For example, if you're learning English vocabulary, don't just memorize the word. Use it in your own sentence. Connect it to your life. Imagine a scenario. Say it out loud. Make it part of your world.
Yes, because meaning transforms short-term memory into long-term memory. The brain doesn't keep things that feel useless. But when something becomes relevant or emotional or practical, the brain says, okay, this is important. Let's store it. That's why active learning beats passive learning. Listening, watching, reading, those are passive. Using, explaining, teaching, connecting, those are active. And active learning forces your brain to build strong memory pathways.
Speaking of pathways, I think we should talk about the idea of memory layers, because information becomes stronger each time it passes through the brain in a different way. First you see it, then you think about it, then you say it in your own words, then you use it in practice, then you recall it later. Each stage adds another layer, and the more layers something has, the harder it is to forget. That's why teachers say review, rewrite, summarize, practice. They're basically helping your brain build thicker memory traces.
Absolutely. And this is also why teaching someone else is like the final boss of memory. When you explain something to another person, you're forced to organize the knowledge, simplify it, and retrieve it from memory. That process alone makes your understanding rock solid. So if someone wants to remember everything they learn, one of the best things they can do is teach it, maybe to a friend, to their mom, or even to themselves out loud. Even pretending works. You can stand in your room and teach the wall. It still strengthens the memory.
And we should also mention the importance of environment. People don't realize how much your surroundings impact your memory. If your study space is noisy, messy, or distracting, your brain is constantly fighting to keep information. But when your environment is clean and quiet, recall becomes easier. Even the smell, light, or temperature can affect your memory. That's why sometimes you remember facts better in the same place where you learned them. It's called context-dependent memory.
Right. And let's not forget the one thing people underestimate the most, sleep. You cannot remember anything long-term if you sleep poorly. Memory consolidation happens mostly during sleep. It's like your brain takes all the things you learned that day and decides what to keep and what to delete. If you sleep enough, the brain organizes everything neatly. If you don't, it's like leaving all your notes scattered on the floor, chaotic, incomplete, easy to lose.
So true. I always tell people, if you want to improve memory fast, don't start with fancy techniques. Start with sleep, hydration, and removing distractions. These basics do more than we think. And once you fix those, then you can add advanced techniques like visualization, association, spaced repetition, chunking, and teaching. Combine them and you basically become unstoppable.
You know, the more we talk about memory, the more I realize that people don't struggle because they're incapable. They struggle because no one ever showed them how memory actually works. We grow up thinking memorizing is just repeating something until it's drilled into our heads. But repetition alone is one of the weakest forms of memory. It works, but it's slow, boring, and often temporary. Real memory comes from interaction with the information. When you add emotion, when you add images, when you add personal meaning, everything changes. And if more students understood that, they would stop saying, "I'm not smart enough," and start saying, "I just need a better approach." I honestly believe anyone can remember anything if they learn how to speak the brain's language.
I agree. And I think one of the biggest mindset shifts people need is to understand that forgetting is normal, even healthy. People get scared when they forget something and think it means their memory is broken. But forgetting is actually the brain protecting itself. It clears out useless details so you don't overload. The trick is teaching your brain what not to forget. That's where review comes in, especially spaced repetition. When you show the brain the same information after increasing intervals, it says, "Ha, you want me to keep this." It's like training a muscle. And it feels so good when you realize that forgetting doesn't make you weak. It makes you human.
Exactly. And that brings us to an important point. The emotional pressure people put on themselves makes remembering harder. When you panic while trying to remember something, your brain enters a stress state, and stress blocks recall. This is why students who know the material at home suddenly blank out during exams. Their brain is not calm enough to access stored information. The funny thing is, if they relaxed for just 10 seconds, the memory would come back instantly. That's why I always tell people, slow breathing, calm mind, and trust your preparation. Your memory works best when you're not fighting it.
That reminds me of something related. Memory improves when you enjoy the process. If learning feels like punishment, your brain resists. But if learning feels like discovery, everything becomes easier. Imagine someone studying history. If they only memorize dates and battles, they'll forget them quickly. But if they dive into the stories, the emotions, the characters, the dramatic events, the same information sticks naturally. That's why documentaries are so much easier to remember than textbooks. Our brains love narratives. So when you're learning something new, you have to turn it into a story. Even math concepts have stories if you look for them.
And the cool thing is, once you understand the power of stories, you can apply it to anything. Names, lessons, facts, even daily reminders. If I need to remember to buy eggs on the way home, I don't just repeat eggs, eggs, eggs. I imagine a giant egg rolling across the road in front of my car. It sounds crazy, but that image is unforgettable. And people forget small tasks because they try to rely on pure logic. Logical memory fades quickly unless you reinforce it. Visual memory, emotional memory, unusual memory, those are the ones that stay. So even something simple like remembering a grocery list can be turned into a fun mental movie.
Exactly. And speaking of fun, let's talk about chunking because it's such a powerful technique. Our brains can't handle long strings of information at once, but they can handle small, meaningful groups. Like if I say 1945, 1968, 1994, that's hard to remember. But if I chunk it as 1945, 1968, 1994, suddenly it's easy. 3 pieces instead of 12. Language learners do this all the time without realizing it, like memorizing phrases instead of individual words, or learning vocabulary in groups like kitchen words, travel words, emotion words. The brain loves categories because they give structure, and structure means less mental effort.
And that connects to something deeper. Your brain wants to understand before it memorizes. Understanding is actually the strongest form of memory. If you understand a concept, you barely need to memorize it. It sticks naturally. That's why explaining things to yourself or simplifying them into your own words is so effective. The moment you can explain it simply, your memory has already done half the work. People who rely only on memorization without understanding end up forgetting everything during stress. But those who truly understand can recall effortlessly under pressure. It's like the difference between copying a map and actually knowing the city.
And maybe we should talk about the role of identity here, because memory is also connected to how we see ourselves. If you keep telling yourself, I'm forgetful, I have a bad memory, I'm not good at learning, your brain believes you. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you tell yourself, I'm someone who learns effectively, I'm someone who remembers things, your brain starts to cooperate. It pays more attention to the things you say you value. This isn't magic, it's psychology. People underestimate how powerful self-talk and self-image are when it comes to learning. If you think you're capable, your brain works harder for you.
That's such an important point, and I think it leads us to the most practical advice. Build habits that support your memory. A clean space, a consistent note-taking method, regular reviews, intentional focus, sleep, hydration, movement. These are all small things that add up to massive improvement. People chase complicated techniques, but sometimes the basics are what make the biggest difference. Imagine trying to store information in a messy room. You'll lose track. But if your mind and environment are organized, memory becomes smoother, more natural, and way more reliable.
And before we finish, I think people need to hear this. Remembering everything you want is not about becoming a machine. It's about becoming more aware, more intentional, and more connected to what you learn. Memory is a skill. Skills can be trained. But more importantly, memory is a reflection of how you engage with life. The more present you are, the more curious you are, the more active your mind is, the easier remembering becomes. Once you shift your mindset from memorizing to experiencing, everything changes.
Exactly. And memory isn't just about school or exams. It's about improving your life. Remembering names strengthens relationships. Remembering lessons helps you grow. Remembering your goals keeps you focused. When you master your memory, you feel more confident, more capable, and more in control of your mind. And the best part is, you don't need to be a genius. You just need the right tools and the right approach. With the right techniques, anyone can remember anything.